Boo. As a kid growing up, I remember feeling a shift when the GameCube and PS2 and Xbox became the Wii, the PS3 and the 360, more so than I've felt with any console generation since. Maybe that's because console generations since have represented little more than a graphical leap big enough to accurately render a horse's freezing balls, but I think it's more so because it felt like the kinds of games I loved just stopped getting made. I loved colour, I loved the silliness and whimsy of mascot platformers and kart races, even into my adolescence, and I still love them now. Maybe because I feel like I never got closure? At this point, Nintendo are the only big studio really doing stuff like this, save for the occasional indie title called like Jimbo Goes Jumpin' Jive or some shit. That's not a knock at such indie games. Jimbo Goes Jumpin' Jive is probably an 80 on Metacritic at least. But as the Xbox 360 and PS3 approached, the Spyros and the Crashes of my childhood increasingly faded into obscurity. There was one game of the upcoming console generation that I distinctly remember being excited for, and with Nintendo messing around with the whole motion control thing that I was never really into, it was not for the Wii. No, the game I was most excited for was the upcoming 2006 reboot of Sonic the Hedgehog, baby. This is my way of saying I had the hardest teenage years of any gamer in the world, and I am God's strongest soldier. I was a monthly reader of a British gaming magazine, the name of which I cannot remember, a magazine that one month, sometime in the mid to late 2000s, had packaged in with it a demo disc full of tons of trailers and features on big upcoming releases. The front cover of the magazine, as I remember, proudly proclaimed that it had a trailer for the new Sonic, and the new Sonic was the one game that was selling me on one of those big fancy new generation consoles, so I was even more in than before. I popped that bad boy in when I got home, and by the end of this trailer I looked like the fucking guy out of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It may be hard to conceive of with the gift of hindsight, but Sonic 06, Once Upon a Time, was genuinely a very exciting prospect, and this trailer, coming out at a time before largely CGI trailers were quite as prevalent as they are today, was genuinely mind-melting. I was so excited about this fucking thing, I showed my mum. And if I recall, she was like, okay. She knew that the abundance of CGI suggested an unfinished product with bugs and poor optimization. And even with all this hype, Sonic 06 wasn't the only thing I walked away from this demo disc excited about, because elsewhere on this disc was another trailer. Totally unexpected, completely different, and it went a little something like this.
An ever-changing world full of endless possibilities, because this is a world where you get to call the shots. The pinata creatures and plant life that inhabit this land are all determined by you. Our story begins at a small garden that in its heyday was full of life. Heyday? That sounds delicious. Anyway, though now a bit run down, with a little care and consideration, you can restore this spot back to its heyday. With some friendly locals and basic tools to help you along, your garden tending begins. And from the minute you dig your first hole and plant your first seeds, you're well on your way to attracting your first pinata visitors. Then, depending on how you design your garden, additional species will be lured in from the wild to check out your handiwork. If they like what they see, these pinatas may even move in.
This was Viva Pinata, and it totally captivated me. I just couldn't believe how good it looked. Something about the style of this trailer, the narration, hooked me. I kept turning it around in my head for weeks after because I knew I recognised the voice of that narrator. All these years later, by the way, it turns out Hudson Hostachio was voiced by Dan Green. Yeah, fucking Yugi.
I know marijuana is harmful. I know it can't improve my game. I will never dishonor myself or my friends by using drugs. That's playing a game I can't win.
No longer, in my estimations, was Sonic alone bearing the flag of colour and personality for the 7th generation. Viva Pinata was here, and my choice of the Xbox 360 was locked in. When the press got their hands on Sonic 06 and reviews started dropping, I made perhaps the first and only sensible decision I would make in the entirety of my adolescence, and I did not play Sonic 06. The justification of my purchase of the Xbox 360 now rested solely on the shoulders of another November 2006 release. This video is about that game and its 2008 sequel and how criminally underappreciated they are. So before we smash Viva Pinata wide open, some historical context I feel is necessary. When I first saw this trailer for Viva Pinata, and in fact when I bought the game and played it, I did not know that it was made by legendary British developer Rare. Those kind of things don't occur to you when you're a kid. You know, you don't really pay attention to all the logos and stuff that come up before you start the game or watch the movie unless it literally makes you shit yourself like that THX one. I never grew up with the N64 or Banjo-Kazooie or GoldenEye, and thus Viva Pinata's many references, particularly to the former, just went over my head. Knowing what I know now makes Viva Pinata an even more interesting game to discuss to me, because Rare were in a very strange place around the time of this game's development. Viva Pinata was being prototyped and began development in 2002, when Rare was still heavily associated with Nintendo, that year releasing Star Fox Adventures for the GameCube and having just a few years prior pumped out some of the absolute best exclusives in the entire N64 library. Nintendo did not own Rare, but they owned a sizable stake in them and they leaned on them a lot as a second-party developer. And in 2002, in a move that many, including myself in retrospect, find wildly confusing, Nintendo sold that stake in Rare, which was then bought up, of all companies, by Microsoft. This is important context because based on the timeline, I think you can reasonably assume that Viva Pinata was probably originally envisioned as being on a Nintendo console. Viva Pinata is a game filled with so much charm and colour and personality that it's absolutely no wonder that no one played it, because it released on the Xbox 360, a console that no one was buying for any of those things. People were buying the Xbox 360 to play as big burly white guys with guns and call each other slurs across international borders. The Xbox 360 was defined by grit and masculinity. As if to illustrate how no one else seemed to care about Viva Pinata as much as me, you'll likely notice the quality of the footage in this video oscillating quite a bit throughout, the 1080p 60fps stuff coming from me, and the lower quality stuff generally being more or less the only stuff I can find on YouTube, because practically no one reputable has recorded footage of this game in the past 10 years. The names of my pinatas will probably also be a dead giveaway as to when you're seeing my footage, because I'm a freak. I may be the only person I know who could lean into the partition of a church confessional and tell the priest, "Father, my name is Fudj, and I bought the Xbox 360 for Viva Pinata." And as he recoils in horror, unable to contain his shock and awe, I continue. And I was perfectly satisfied with my purchase. Viva Pinata is a little harder to put in a box than a lot of modern games, especially AAA games as they become increasingly homogenous. It's kind of a farming sim. It's also kinda like Zoo Tycoon at the same time. To this day, it's probably the closest thing you could get to a 3D Stardew Valley game aside from Harvest Moon, which is part of the reason I can't believe how it has so little footing in the cultural zeitgeist, because people fucking love Stardew Valley, and if you love Stardew Valley, I think you'll love this, even now. The premise is pretty simple. You've been given this ramshackle, dilapidated old garden, and it's up to you to fix her up and start bringing some life back to the place. In doing so, you'll grow flowers, plant trees, dig ponds, and eventually attract wild pinatas to visit your garden. Why are they pinatas rather than regular animals, you ask? Because it's fun. Get some whimsy in your life. Pinatas initially appear via a charming little cutscene that triggers when you fulfill certain requirements. The liquor toad appears as soon as you unlock the ability to dig ponds, for example. Then it will visit your garden once 1% of your garden is water, and it will outright choose to live there and become a resident if your garden is 2% water and it's eaten a taffly within. There is nothing more exciting than when the adorable appearance cutscene of some rare, exotic pinata shows up. Okay, there are some things more exciting, but it's great, especially when you're not expecting it, and it's not something you are actively trying for. Like, no one expects that having 3 differently coloured butterfly pinatas in your garden is going to do anything, and then boom, the chameleon shows up. And it is because he wants to eat them, but we let him off because he's cute. The pinatas are, as I say, your residents, so it's up to you to hire the builder to build them a house. Every pinata has a unique house design in this game, a lot of them inspired by different countries and cultures, but sometimes they're just the kind of place you'd expect such an animal to live. There's a lot of stylistic diversity in here, and some of the houses are just really cool. I mean, look at the Mallow Wolf house. It reminds me of the home bases in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, for anyone who's played those games, how they're shaped like the player's head. Beyond housing them, you can further build out the garden to suit their needs, feed them stuff they like, and even fulfill their romance requirements so that they might do a romance dance and subsequently pop out a baby. That sounds like a euphemism, but the romance dance is a real thing. It's an actual dance that pinatas of the same species do when you fulfill the requirements they need to romance and then point them to each other. This is how you make babies in Viva Pinata, and I assume in real life, though I might need someone to explain to me in the comments if I'm wrong. I think vivid detail would be helpful. Thanks in advance. The best parts of Viva Pinata are often when you get to just sit back once you're content with your work and enjoy your garden in motion. Who knows what will happen? Maybe one of your residents will take a drink from the pond. Maybe someone will have a nap on the grass. Maybe one of your geese will perch atop a lit torch, setting itself on fire and then fly around the garden in a panic whilst you chase it down trying to save it with a watering can. There you go. Mysterious Mung is happy now. Oh, he's done it again. There isn't really a definitive endpoint or goal for Viva Pinata, but there are some pretty intensive exotic pinatas you can aim to get, the most intensive of which being the Dragonosh, who requires entire buildings to be built and workers to be hired so that you might retrieve his egg. You hire workers, by the way, by going to the village menu and talking to Arthur, this man with a tankard for a head. Viva Pinata is full of characters with weird things for heads. Some of them kind of charming, some of them kind of, well. The village menu contains all the basic amenities you'll be needing to keep up with maintaining your garden. There's a shop, there's a doctor who can help pinatas when they get sick, which we'll get to in a bit, there's the builder, there's the tinker who can turn basic items into more sophisticated versions of themselves that are often used to attract pinatas, bread into sandwiches, for example, very impressive. Teach me your ways, mysterious garden wizard, among many others. For a game that's so relaxed and about just taking in the vibes, there's a surprising depth of complexity to Viva Pinata. Not only does every business person at the village represent a different mechanic, but there's further mechanics within those. This is probably my only real complaint with the game. It does poorly tutorialize some of its more subtle mechanics. It often feels practically necessitated that you look up an online guide to figure out how some stuff works. Fertilizer is a good example of this. It can be used to grow plants that yield more crops, but only if you use a fertilizer that it's compatible with. There is no way to tell which colour fertilizer is compatible with which plant aside from listening to a weirdly quiet sound cue and figuring out which is the "this is incompatible and will not have any effect" sound cue and the "this is correct and will give you the desired effect" sound cue. There are some trees late in the game that need to be fertilized to grow to full maturity, and the game never explains to you that this sound effect is the key to figuring out which fertilizer is correct, so you're left just kind of taking stabs in the dark if you never look this up or somehow figure it out on your own. The Dragonosh, which I just mentioned, is also incredibly cryptic. I said you've got to make a building and hire a worker, but there's even more going on than that, and none of it is ever explained to you. Later on in the game, you unlock a second merchant by the name of Ivor Bargain, who sells a whole bunch of weird shit that the main merchant doesn't. One such weird shit is an item called the Captain's Cutlass, which interacts with a hugely important game mechanic in a crucial way, and its purpose is only so much as hinted at in its notes section in the game's journal. The Captain's Cutlass, as it turns out, stops ruffians from entering your garden. Ruffians are these nasty looking little red guys who roll up into your garden at random intervals and cause trouble unless you hit them with a shovel, a method that I find generally helps stop lots of things from causing trouble. If unchecked, a ruffian will puke up sour sweets that will make your pinata seriously seriously ill if they eat them, which they will because they have all the self-preservation instincts of actual koalas. They also tend to pick fights with other pinatas, which can also result in them needing a visit from the doctor. And if they have to cross water in your garden at any point to achieve their general shithousery, they'll puke up dirt to travel across, filling your pond and making you have to dig it back out again. In this sense, the ruffians are practically identical to the sour pinatas. Nasty red variants of existing pinatas who have been turned sour. These guys will show up and do more or less the same thing the ruffians are doing, the difference being that these guys can be cured. If you assist them in meeting similar requirements to what most pinatas require to become residents or romance, you'll find that the sour pinata is purified, and you have yourself a grateful new member of the garden. The big boss in charge of the ruffians, and the ever-present threat that looms over this game, is Professor Pester. Yes, I am aware of how silly I sound in saying some of the words I'm saying in this video. I'm 28 and I've learned to let life take me where it may. Hard to believe as it may seem, Viva Pinata has a villain. And it's this guy. This guy also shows up at random intervals, running down the path from the volcano that towers over the game's map. Once he enters your garden, he picks a pinata at random and, no exaggeration, marks it for death. Once that pinata is marked, there's nothing you can do. You can't even sell it. Professor Pester whacks the poor thing with a stick and it promptly explodes into candy, which, funnily enough, you actually can sell right in the brief moments before he hoovers it all up, getting most of the value back from the pinata he's just killed. Thanks for doing the hard part for me, buddy. Perhaps this all sounds too stressful for a game that's otherwise supposed to be relaxing, and if you're averse to any kind of friction, like I think some modern farming sim enjoys have kind of become, maybe it is. And this isn't even the end of it. There are weeds that can pop up in your garden, spreading their seeds to multiply and spout crops that make your pinatas sick. Some species of pinata, like the liquor toad and nougat, don't get along and can get into fights that end with a guy who's like 3 times the size of the other somehow getting his ass beat and just kind of lying there a bit embarrassed. Hope there's no Russians watching. But careful planning and diligent organisation can remedy all of these problems, and the game itself is made all the more satisfying for it. When the garden is at peace, it is truly idyllic, and it feels earned, and it can stay that way. By learning which pinatas tend to beef with each other, you can keep them apart with fences, or just not keep those species in the same garden at the same time. When you purify a sour pinata, an effigy of it is added to a totem pole just outside the garden, which stops any more of that species from wandering in, and the aforementioned Captain's Cutlass keeps Professor Pester out as well as the ruffians. But there's an even bolder solution: a fence. Yeah, if you build cheap fences around the part of the garden Professor Pester is supposed to enter from, he literally just gets stuck there for the rest of the game, grumbling that he can't get in. It was a simpler time. And as I say, this friction makes the eventual peace feel earned. When all the threats are at bay and you can just work on prettying up your garden, moulding it to your image with houses, ornaments, ponds and plants, it is bliss. Absolutely one of the most therapeutic games I've ever played. The only stress now is trying to get some of the late game pinatas with their bonkers requirements. I made this garden over 70% water to try and get the chippopotamus to visit me, and all he ever does is look in from the periphery like an angel who refuses to descend to earth. When he eventually joins my heavenly choir, he will surely sing alongside my many sweet-tooths and dragonflies, and certainly my prized crocodile, the holiest pinata of all. Tell me, viewer, have you ever seen a more perfect creature? Marvel at him, his shape, his beauty, his glory. Truly, he is the perfect life form. He is what God hopes for all of us. Let's address the elephanilla in the room. This game is gorgeous. It's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot these days, but Viva Pinata truly has not aged a day. Not in its mechanics, and certainly not in its visuals. It's one of the things that captured me most when I first saw that trailer in 2006. Its art style is so considered and precise, so cartoonish and flavourful that it's allowed it to hold up beautifully even 2 decades later. This game looks so good it could literally release now and you wouldn't bat an eyelid. It is is a total treat for the eyes, and even playing it on Xbox Game Pass with no FPS boost functionality or visual upgrades whatsoever in the mid-2020s, it is still just stunning. Nothing else that came out in 2006 can have looked this good. I'll bet my sculpted little arse on it. You gain the greatest appreciation for this, as I say, when all has become calm and you just sit back and enjoy your garden in motion, finally content with your work. Here's Weed King relaxing in the sun. Here's actual Weed King, who's been stuck in a fencing panel for 6 days, but he's still having a good time. Viva Pinata is a little glitchy, especially as pertains to fencing, but this is one of many minor gripes that would be well and truly batted away upon the release of Viva Pinata's sequel, Trouble in Paradise, in 2008. I could wax lyrical about this original Viva Pinata forever, but if you can believe it, there's an even better version of this game out there that I simply have to gush about before I've expended all the positivity that the government will allow me, a British man, to express in one day. Let's talk Trouble in Paradise. But before we do, did you know that there was a Viva Pinata game on DS as well? Yeah, Viva Pinata Pocket Paradise. I can't remember too much about it myself, but I know I put a lot of hours into it, so I'm pretty sure it was good. I'm doubly sure because it was implicitly an influence on this video's sponsor, Nanomon Virtual Pet. That's right, today's sponsor is no organisation or company, but in fact a humble indie game. So come on, I'm gonna guilt you. You can hear me out for 60 seconds. Hatched from the depths of cyberspace, your Nanomon is a virtual pet that chills out on your desktop. Nanomon need to be cared for, raised and trained to uncover the secrets of the nanoscape, an ever-changing world filled with monsters and mini-games. There are over 25 unique evolutions to be discovered en route to reaching the uncharted depths of the nanoscape. What kind of tamer will you be? If you enjoy stuff like Tamagotchi in the original Digimon world, and maybe even a little bit like Viva Pinata, specifically on the DS, you can't miss out on Nanomon Virtual Pet, which is available on Steam right now and with very positive reviews, I might add. Its Steam store page as well as the Nanomon Virtual Pet Discord will be linked in the pinned comment of this video. Give it a try if you're one of those who like supporting the kinds of games that just don't get made anymore. That's Nanomon Virtual Pet. Thank you for sponsoring this video. Releasing less than 2 years after the original Viva Pinata, Trouble in Paradise didn't have time to change much. In fact, I actually interspersed some Trouble in Paradise footage into parts of the video already, and if you haven't played these games, you probably didn't even notice that anything was different. Its similarity to its predecessor caught it some flack from critics who otherwise liked it, but generally bemoaned its lack of newness. I suppose thinking that a sequel should feel a little more evolutionary than Trouble in Paradise. I'd argue that the game was made in less than 2 years, and it clearly didn't have the time for particularly sweeping changes. Sure, you could then say that they should have taken longer to make the game, or that they should have been given more time to make a more substantial sequel, and maybe I'd even agree, but then you're not judging the game on its own merits and in its own context, but instead you're effectively saying this should have been a different game, and docking at points for that. For a sequel made in less than 2 years, Trouble in Paradise is fantastic. It retains all the good qualities of the original and builds on them, and adds absolutely no bad stuff in the process. The most significant change to Trouble in Paradise is the addition of the desert, and pinarctic biomes, a pair of locations you can visit filled with a whole bunch of new pinatas exclusive to these environments. You can place baited traps to capture these pinatas, then unpack their crates in your main garden and fulfill their residency requirements once they're inside to make them a full-time member of your garden. This often involves placing down new terrain like sand and snow, which you'll have to be mindful with placing in your garden because you want to have some of it to satisfy the desert and arctic pinatas who like it, but you also don't want to turn off your typical normie grass-loving pinatas. Roll with the times, hippies. Pot is ruining our youth. Beyond this, there's a bunch of little quality of life changes, like not having to wait for half a second for Lottie's icon to pop up over something you want to sell before you can move on to the next, and being able to set corners when you dig a pond to create perfectly evened out bodies of water. But the name of the game with Trouble in Paradise is stuff. more of it. With a whole new swath of pinatas comes a whole bunch of new ways to change pre-existing pinatas into new species. Yeah, that's right, I didn't even talk about this during the section on the original game, but this is a mechanic. Pinatas can evolve. By putting out a taffly that's been set on fire, you'll see it turn into a red hot, which can now fight back against its natural predator, the liquor toad, and also be sold for lots of money, which is a really effective way to make fast cash, but you wouldn't set all your innocent flies on fire just for that, right? You can change a sparrow mint into a canary simply by feeding it the head of a buttercup flower. Evolution methods like this, as well as some weirder ones, were all over the original Viva Pinata, but in Trouble in Paradise, the game's chock full of them. Some of these evolutions, as was the case in the original, are needlessly cryptic, but great fun. Feed your fudge hog a coconut and it becomes a parmadillo. Give a raspberry a cheesecake, now it's a hoggurt. Yeah, you heard me right, hoggurt. That's not even my favourite pinata name in this game. I'm quite partial to Flapyak. If for some unspeakable reason you tire of the fizzly bear, you can feed him a blue gem and have him change into the humble Arctic Palolly bear, like Unit here. Why does he moan like that? Can I change him back? I've also waited until now to talk about it for a reason, but Viva Pinata's music is just sublime. Some of the most tranquil, peaceful video game compositions I can think of. The tracks in these games run the gamut from goofy and plodding to mirror all the silly creatures sauntering around in your garden, to soothing and emotional, like the tracks that tend to fade in when you're just watching life go by in the middle of the night, admiring the splendour of your sleeping pinatas. Can you stop making that noise? The composer for these games was Grant Kirkhope, a frequent fixture of Rare's games from the 90s to the late 2000s, most known nowadays for his work on Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64. I've never met Grant. He seems like a really nice guy who loves what he does and is rightfully proud of what he's contributed, and I don't want to speak for him, but I wonder if sometimes he feels a bit put in a box because of the legacy of those aforementioned soundtracks. He's brilliant at the goofy, light-hearted stuff, sure, but it's when you play Viva Pinata that you're reminded that he's a composer. That means he's good at making music of all kinds. I say this because Viva Pinata's music is often just insanely beautiful. And if you'd only known of Kirkhope as a composer, as the silly DK rap guy, maybe you'd never consider that he's also capable of stuff that sounds like it's come straight out of a golden age Disney movie. That's the thing about art. If you're good in one style and you've had the opportunities to show that a lot, people do kind of typecast you a bit. Coming from a writing background, people like to kind of put comedy writers and soap writers and children's authors in very different boxes, but a lot of the skills you learn when developing your style are fundamental, which is to say they're transferable. You'd be perfectly capable, in fact likely very good at another style because you know the fundamentals. People just get this idea that because you've tended to write in a certain style or make music in a certain genre, that's the only style you're really good at. I mean, I've been making silly YouTube videos about video games for nearly 6 years now. You don't think that means that's all I'm capable of, right? Actually, don't answer that one. One of the standout tracks from Viva Pinata Trouble in Paradise is a song called Bedtime Story. It's a song Kirkhope composed as he knew his days with Rare, who he'd worked with for well over a decade at this point, were coming to a close, frustrated with the Microsoft acquisition. I really think you need to hear the song because it is astonishingly beautiful, and I'm going to show some quotes from Kirkhope about the track on screen whilst it plays. When I was a kid, I used to tell everyone who would listen that I wanted to be a game designer. It was my #1 ambition, and it's something I still think about a lot even now. What I didn't realise at the time, and what I only realise in retrospect, is that specifically I would have wanted to be a part of a company like Rare. A company consistently imaginative and original, never resting on their laurels, always trying new stuff and somehow always being good at it. This was a company that celebrated silliness and fun, and it's no surprise that people are so nostalgic about their games because they're exactly the kinds of games that create nostalgia. Colourful, creative, so evocative of childlike wonder and whimsy. That's something that I think is largely missing from AAA games nowadays, with only Nintendo really leading the charge. The phrase, "they don't make them like this anymore," is a bit of a cliche in this day and age, but they really don't make them like this anymore. Can you even imagine any time in the next decade a big publisher getting behind funding and putting a big marketing push behind what is essentially a very eccentric farming sim? One with a premise as kooky and weird as this? No, it wouldn't be guaranteed to make them as much money as a game about a guy with a gun that looks like a movie, or a game about a guy with a sword in a big open world, so it's left to indie games and Nintendo and a few second-party developers to pick up the slack. Video games can be anything, and at the risk of sounding like Jack Thompson, or Lois Griffin, that doesn't always have to mean violence, or even adventure. A game about a bunch of silly, sentient pinatas living in a garden can be just as high art as anything else. And you don't just have to take my word for it. Viva Pinata and Trouble in Paradise are still easily accessible today via Xbox Game Pass. They absolutely still hold up, and I think a lot of people back in the day missed out on what are true gems. Games that people would absolutely remember more fondly were they just on the Nintendo consoles. It surely seems like they were originally destined for. I really do urge you to give them a try and see if you find them as magical as I do, because even playing them in 2025, they still make me feel the exact same way they did when I first played them on the 360 all those years ago. Like, these games deserved better. Like Rare deserved better. Like what are now Platonic deserve better. And certainly they still do. And we can still give that to them. Or at least maybe just a slither. By just showing that we care. Thank you to my high tier patrons: Good Chicken, Christopher Monk, Flashing Fire, Tale of the Toaster, Justin Duncan Mills, Garm, Super, Cactus, Boomer Callis, Salad Dinner, Squidwog, Rylander, TOJ Davis, Mackerel Bean, Martint, Faye, Cyberpunk Chimney, Kareem Najar, The Return of BBF69, Uma, Buttered Legs, Yo Adrian, Zooms, Sticky Spin, Zerk, Ria Starthay, Will WC, Reby, Ruby Starbloom, and Deeb Scrub. A reminder that you too can get your name in the end credits, as well as early video access and my eternal gratitude by signing up at patreon.com/nocturnalfudge, the link for which will be in the description. Thank you guys very much. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you again probably pretty soon for an announcement. I'll talk to you then.